after the tribulation and the millennial. Like I said, David had a dream to build a permanent dwelling place for the Lord, permanent meaning a temple. But the Lord told David, "You're a bloody man," and he was, because he had had many wars. So he was allowed to gather the materials for the temple, but it wasn't until Solomon came along until the temple was actually built. And that masterpiece of construction that Solomon built stood until the fall of Judah to Babylon, when it was destroyed, and the Jewish people were either killed or taken to Babylon. We've been studying about that for the last several weeks, so that shouldn't be different to any of you. Oops, sorry. When the captives returned from Babylon, Zerubbabel built another less glorious temple. Remember when that temple was finished, the people kind of cried and said, "This is nothing like we used to have." But it was a temple. And then Herod came along and refurbished the temple and created an architectural wonder that took 46 years to complete. And it was a marvel. They say you could see it from 60 to 100 miles away as you came into Jerusalem. And it stood as a tremendous splendor above the skyline. With the destruction of this temple by the Romans in 70 AD and the ensuing worldwide dispersion of the Jews, there was no longer any sacrifices, for there was no longer a temple. But since that time, within the breast of the most Jewish people, there has been a deep longing for a place on Mount Moriah in which they could again worship their God. The prophecies of the Bible reveal that this desire will one day be satisfied. There are yet 2 temples, as I said, to be built in Jerusalem. Just give me 1 second. One will be constructed just prior or during the days of the tribulation period. This is the temple spoken of by the prophet Daniel, but another temple more vast than any of its predecessors will be built in the holy city of Jerusalem during the 1,000-year reign of Christ, a period known as the millennium. The prophet Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Micah give many details concerning this temple. Now, when I say the millennium simply means 1,000. So, or when I say the kingdom age, or when I say the millennium, or the 1,000-year reign, they're all the same. They're just called by 3 different names. And by the way, when the Lord's Prayer is prayed all around the world by many every day, you pray, "Thy kingdom come," right? That's what you're praying for. The kingdom reign of Christ here on this earth during the kingdom age. All right, the tribulation temple, the church will be taken out of this world to meet the Lord in the air, possibly very soon, I believe. Shortly after the 70th week of Daniel's prophecy will begin. Daniel 9:24 to 27 says this will be a period of God's judgment on the earth in preparation for the return of the Messiah at its close. During this turbulent period, the godless Gentile world system will experience an unparalleled outpouring of God's wrath, and Israel will suffer through the birth pains of their reconciliation to Christ. Nowhere in Scripture is it explicitly stated that there will be a temple built during this time. But there are many passages suggesting this will occur. For example, Daniel spoke of sacrifices and oblations during this period in Daniel 9:27. For Daniel's prophecy to be fulfilled, a Jewish temple must be built, and it must be in Jerusalem. Throughout the prophetic portions of the Word of God, there are indications that a unique individual very unique, called the Antichrist. By the way, 1 John 2:18 to 22 is the only place he is called the Antichrist. He has probably 50 or different names in the Bible, but this is specifically where he's called the Antichrist. And he will rise to power on the earth following the rapture of the church, and he will promise Israel, that the Jewish people, something for which they have longed for centuries: peace. Something that Israel has never had except during the last days of David and during the days of Solomon. He will ensure that peace through a covenant confirmed with Israel for a 7-year period. In all probability, it will be during this time that a new temple will be built in Jerusalem. That is, however, a possibility that the construction may be started and completed just prior to us being taken out of this world. By the way, I've been told, and several people have mentioned this, that the Orthodox Jews have already gathered the materials for that temple. They're underground where nobody can see them. Otherwise, I'm sure that the Muslims would destroy them. But they're already ready. So these materials, they just have to be put together and the temple will be there. When the temple is finished and dedicated, the Levitical system of sacrifices could be reinstituted and returned to its full importance. The scriptures seem to indicate that following the confirmation of the covenant of peace between Israel and Antichrist, there will be a peace period for a period of time. And in this middle of this 7-year period, the Antichrist is going to demand worship. He will build an image of himself on the altar, and the Jewish people will break the covenant because of that and will not accept Jesus as God, neither will they accept the Antichrist. Now, we all have been familiar with this passage, but in 2 Thessalonians 2, 3, and 4, it says, "For that day shall not come except there come a falling away first." Think we're in a falling away period? I think we're kind of there. "And the man of sin," the Antichrist, that's another name for him, "be revealed, the son of perdition," another name, "who opposes and exalted himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself as God. But for this event to transpire, another temple must be built in Jerusalem." The man of sin is likened to another scriptural character mentioned in the Old Testament, New Testament, and the Apocryphal. This man is called Antiochus Epiphanes. You've probably heard of that guy back in the book of Daniel. And he's described in Daniel chapters 8 and 11. He came to power following the division of the Greek Empire after the death of Alexander the Great. His determined pole was to Hellenize the entire kingdom, which brought him into direct conflict with the Jews. As the zenith of this conflict, Antiochus defiled the Jewish temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar, and then the Maccabean revolt began. Antiochus is a picture of the Antichrist, who will be raised up in the end times, 3.5 years after the covenant is made with Israel. And he will enter the temple, desecrate its altar, placing an image of himself, and demand that the Jewish people worship him. And of course, this is going to be broken. And this period called Jacob's trouble, period of Jacob's trouble, that's what the Jews call it. We call it the tribulation. And it's a time of horrible Holocaust for the Jews will begin. All right, now let's look at the millennial temple. And this is Ezekiel's chapters 40 through 48. And I'm just going to do a summary of this because all of the measurements and all of the different details of this temple you'd probably lose it before I got into it. At the end of the tribulation, Jesus Christ will return to earth in all his glory, and he will establish his kingdom and throne in Jerusalem and begin his 1,000-year reign. A glorious millennial temple will be constructed, far surpassing the temple built by Solomon, Zerubbabel, and Herod. Through the prophet Ezekiel, the Lord said that this temple will be the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the children of Israel forever. That is in Ezekiel 43:7. Now there's a passage in Revelation, which I've listed in your notes there, that sounds a little bit in conflict because our home is going to be in the New Jerusalem. The Jews' home is going to be in a rebuilt Jerusalem. Now, that's not in conflict. Here's what sounds a little in conflict. Now, when the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven, John, writing in the book of Revelation, says in 21, "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and also there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God." You're going to see a little bit later that I believe that the church will be in the New Jerusalem. And I've said this before, the Jews will have their temple and a big portion of this earth. If you go back to Genesis, they gave them like 10 times the land forever that they would inherit. So during the kingdom age, they will have all of that land. You're going to see in a minute how all of this is expanded so much. How could it fit in Israel? It's going to be a much bigger Israel than it is today. The other case here is, how can he dwell in the New Jerusalem with the church and also dwell in the millennial temple with the Jews? Well, he's God. So I'm not going to question how he can do that. He's God. He can do whatever he wants to do. But the size and magnificence of this millennial temple is amazing. The size of the structure to be built in the millennium almost defies imagination. It will tower above the skyline of the city and the rising sun, golden in splendor, glistening in beauty. At dawn or sunset, noon or night, the temple will be the focal point of Jerusalem. In fact, after I went through this, I said, if they still have them then, it would be the number one of the 7 wonders of the world, or the new world, because it is absolutely amazing. Okay, Ezekiel chapters 40 to 42 give very exacting measurements of this building. Ezekiel records the dimensions of the porches, the gates, the rooms, and the thickness of the walls, and told how it will fit together. Those measures are summarized in Ezekiel 42:15 to 20. You could just read that passage alone and figure out the size of this temple. The temple area itself will measure 500 reeds on each side of 4 sides. A reed is approximately 10 feet. The millennial temple will therefore be approximately 1 square mile. There's never been a building on this earth 1 square mile. It will be the largest and most magnificent structure ever erected, and it will all be for the glory of God. To give you a kind of a similarity here for a second, the original tabernacle that was carried through the wilderness was 15 foot wide, 11 foot high, and 30 foot long. Tiny. Of course it had to be, because they carried it through the wilderness, and they would put it up, tear it down, take it when they went on. Give you another comparison. The temple that Solomon built was 180 foot long and 90 foot wide. So in comparison to this, it was also tiny. The temple, along with its accompanying outer areas, will be far larger than the present-day Jerusalem. The entire city, this one building. The first clue to major topographical changes is found tucked away in an obscure verse in Ezekiel 20:40. Here's what it says. For in mine holy mountain, in the mountain of the height of Israel, saith the Lord God, There shall be all the house of Israel, all of those in the land serve me. And Isaiah says this in a similar section, the word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow into it, and many people shall go and say, Come ye, let us go unto the mountain of the Lord, the house of the God of Jacob. That's Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Now, Micah wrote a parallel passage in Micah 4 through 1 and 2. I'm not going to read because it's similar. Now, present-day Jerusalem, how many have been to present-day Jerusalem? Quite a few. You've been there. Present-day Jerusalem is 2,500 feet above sea level. It's built on 7 hills, not high hills. It's not large enough to contain even the future temple area spoken of in the scripture. How then can all these promises be fulfilled? Well, Zechariah answered that question because he indicated that at least 3 major geological and topographical changes will take place when the Messiah returns to the earth at his second advent. The first one being the Mount of Olives will be split open from the east to the west. Now, you remember when Jesus went to heaven, ascended into heaven, after he was here, he left from the Mount of Olives. And then an angel said, Why are you gazing into the sky? As the Son of Man went into heaven, so shall he return. So when he touches down the second time, he will touch down on the Mount of Olives. But Zechariah says the Mount of Olives will be split from east to west, and the remaining embattled inhabitants of Jerusalem will flee from the city breach. That's in Zechariah 14:4-5. Second, living waters will flow toward both the Mediterranean and Dead Sea. Zechariah 14:8. For this to occur, Jerusalem will have to be lifted up. By the way, there's no water in Jerusalem now. It's the only, I don't know if it's a major city, but it is a major city because it is the eternal city. There's no water there. Every major city just about in the world is built on some kind of a lake or has some kind of a lake or several near. Jerusalem has nothing. So that's going to have to happen in these changes. Now, Revelation 22, 1 and 2, it also talks about this similar thing. And now, we're talking about another thing now, the New Jerusalem. And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of the street and on either side of the river was the tree of life, which bore 12 fruits, each tree yielding its fruit every month. The leaves of the trees were for the healing of the nations. That's another thing here, but it will be similar to what John talked about in Revelation. And here is Zechariah 14:10, which is a key verse. All the land shall be turned like Arabah from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem shall be lifted up and inhabited in its place, from Benjamin's gate and to the place of the first gate and to the corner gate, and from the tower of Haniel and unto the king's winepress. That just simply tells you that Jerusalem will be lifted way up from where it currently sits today. Not only will Jerusalem be raised up as a high mountain, it will be greatly enlarged as well. Ezekiel 45:1 says this, the holy portion of the land will be immense, measuring 25,000 by 25,000 breeds. This is an area of 50 by 50 miles. We're talking about Jerusalem, or about 2,500 square miles, and it will be the center of the worship of God. The northern section will be 50 by 20 miles, and the center of that section will stand the temple, which will be 1 mile square, we told you earlier, and a segment of priests will reside in the remainder of the area. The central portion, also 50 by 20 miles, will be reserved for the Levites, with a southern section of 50 by 10 miles reserved for the building millennial Jerusalem, 10 by 10 miles. And for growing food, as we ponder the immensity of this, we will get a better picture of how big our God is. Now let me say this, the New Jerusalem, which is going to be the home of the church, the measurements of it. Now, let me say that many believe the New Jerusalem coming down out of the sky. Some believe that it will be sitting above the earth, and people will go back and forth. And in Revelation, it talks about the kings of the nations bringing their glory into the New Jerusalem. You probably read that. What does that mean? It means that there are going to be people living in the earth. Some others believe that it will be set down upon the earth. If it did that, it would go from New Jersey to Alabama. That's how big it would be. So I kind of believe it's going to be above the earth, but that's just my opinion. There are other opinions about that. Now, chapters 9 to 11 talks about the presence of God in the millennial temple. Of Ezekiel were possibly the most difficult in the book for the prophet to pen. In this passage, he had to tell of the Shekinah glory. I think most of you know what that is. It's the glory that filled the temple when the temple was built, the tabernacle when it was built. But this was difficult. In this passage, he had to tell the Shekinah glory of God leaving his people. For centuries, the glory of God had been with Israel. He led them in their wilderness journeys and was in the tabernacle and temple. But because of their idolatry and turning from the Lord, the Shekinah glory of God left them. You remember there was Ichabod written upon that, meaning the glory departed from Israel. It was written over the nation, and Ezekiel had to record that event, being a Jew, a priest. But now in the vision of the millennial temple and the worship involved, Ezekiel was privileged to look far beyond the days to see the glory of God return to the city and to the people. Chapter 43 gives a breathtaking account of the glory of God returning through the eastern gate. Remember when Jesus returns, he comes through the eastern gate. Now if you've been to Jerusalem, you will know that the Muslims, when they had control of Jerusalem, they sealed the eastern gate. Then they put a graveyard in front of it. They said if Jesus comes back, he's not going to go through the graveyard, and he's not going to get into the temple because we got it sealed off. You can see it today if you go to Jerusalem. It's sealed up. But it won't be when he gets there. It'll just, the gate will fall down or something. The description corresponds to John's account of the return of Jesus Christ in the book of Revelation. Ezekiel 43:2 and Revelation 1:15. You return to this new temple and dwell in the inner court. The presence of the Lord will return to a Jewish temple in Jerusalem and will remain there. Let me read that passage out of the Bible. Ezekiel 43:2. It says, behold, the glory of God of Israel came from the way of the east. His voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. It was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when I came to destroy the city. The visions were like the vision which I saw by the river Chebar and fell on my face. Remember when Ezekiel started out in the ministry, I think he saw this vision of the throne of God and these wheels and these thrones and all this magnificent thing that would just startle you. He says it will be similar to that when he returns. Okay, the priesthood in the millennial temple. The Bible is clear that those who minister in the millennial temple, the priests, will be from the sons of Nadab. Well, why is that? That's in Ezekiel 40:46. They alone, of all the Levites, who remained faithful to the Lord in the time of David. The designation, the sons of Zadok, is helpful in two ways. First, it proves the literalness of the future millennial temple, since the real names are used. In other words, some people believe this will be a spiritual temple, it won't be a literal temple, but if names of people are used, it's going to be a literal temple. Second, it once again provides God's faithfulness with his people, or at least a portion of them remain faithful to him. God rewards faithfulness. You've heard me say before that there's two buckets. I believe that all rewards fit in one or the other. One is suffering for the cause of Christ, and the other is for faithfulness. I've also said many times I don't suffer well, so I'm trying to fill the other bag. But it's his choice of whether I will or not, and I certainly could have it. But they will be rewarded for their faithfulness. Second, it once again proves God's faithfulness when his people, or at least a portion of them, remain faithful to him. God rewards it. Zadok's reward will be access to God's presence and the privilege of ministering in all phases of the priestly duties. You know, I don't know this for a fact, but I've always thought the rewards are going to be how close you are to the Lord or how far away you are from the Lord. And now, 1 Corinthians tells us there will be some that will get into heaven as though by fire. In other words, they'll make it in, but they're going to be a long ways away. There'll be others that we could look way up there and see how faithful they were. But that's just a theory. That's not a fact. I can't prove it. The sacrifices of the millennial temple. Now we get to the most controversial part of the millennial temple. Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48 clearly state that sacrifices will be offered in this magnificent temple. A multitude of sacrifices. The questions are often asked, why sacrifices? Doesn't the book of Hebrews teach us that the sacrificial atoning death of Christ was once for all? And it does. And totally sufficient. The answers to these questions have long been the subject of controversy. And that's why a lot of people spiritualize this millennial temple. The future sacrifices will be a continuous memorial of the work of Christ on the cross. They will in no way detract from his redeeming work at Calvary. Nothing to do that. The millennial sacrifices will be no more redemptive than the sacrifices offered before Calvary of the sacrifice that continued from Calvary up until 70 A.D. I personally believe that God himself had the temple in Jerusalem destroyed because he didn't want any more sacrifices offered, because they were offering them in vain, which was after Christ died, was resurrected, and ascended. Now here's the comparison. Since it was instituted by Christ the night before his crucifixion, the church has celebrated the Lord's Supper as a memorial for his death, as we did this morning. This does not detract from the cross, but serves as a constant reminder of what Christ did for us. Perhaps since Israel did not receive their Messiah at his first coming and have never celebrated a memorial of his redemptive work, the sacrificial system of the millennium will serve that purpose. Also, it must be remembered the book of Hebrews was not written for the millennial period. Now, here's the main thing to consider here. If you say that there's going to be sacrifices during that period of time, they will look back at the cross. The sacrificial system before looked forward to the cross, but these will actually look back at his death on the cross. Okay, so let me get to the what's in it for me. What are you going to do? How are you going to live? That's what, everybody wants to know. What does it mean? Okay, how does it affect me? First of all, let me say in Romans 15:4, this verse is very apropos, particularly when you're studying the Old Testament. It says, For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. So everything in the Old Testament is meant for our learning. Isaiah is the only Old Testament prophet that wrote about eternity future. Only one. And he wrote it in one verse. Isaiah 65:17, he said there'll be new heavens and new earth. All the other prophets in the Old Testament saw only the kingdom age, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, which they viewed as eternity. Because nowhere in the Old Testament does it say how long it's going to be. Only when we get to the book of Revelation, in chapter 20, it tells us it's going to be 1,000 years. They didn't know. When they wrote of the kingdom age, that was their heaven. So you get to the New Testament, Revelation chapter 20, some people say, well, it's only in one place. It's repeated 6 times in 6 verses, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Neither did the prophets see the church age. There is nothing in the Old Testament written about the church. They didn't know anything about the church. They looked beyond the church to the tribulation period. There's a lot in the Old Testament about the tribulation period. And then to what they viewed as eternity, which is really the kingdom age. So they looked beyond God's wrath and the kingdom age, which gave them hope. Only when Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 16:18, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. When they said, he said the name church, they probably go, what? Who? They never heard that word before. What's that going to be? But that's when he introduced the church. Here's the thing. Jesus was a Jew. His 12 disciples were all Jews, and the early church were 100% Jews. And yet, there's only 2% of Jews today that believe in Jesus Christ. It's amazing. In the New Jerusalem, where the church will be, are the names of the 12 tribes of Israel in the New Jerusalem on the 12 gates. It's to remind us that salvation is of the Jews. Remember what he told the lady, the Samaritan lady at the well? Said salvation is of the Jews. You know, our focus today is on heaven. When we lose our mom or dad or somebody else in the family, heaven is the place where mom went, or dad went, right? But that is a temporary place. Our home, our permanent home, is going to be in the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, as I showed you in Revelation 21. When Jesus said to his disciples, I go to prepare a place for you, I believe he meant the permanent place in the New Jerusalem where we will reside. Do you think the temple millennium is big in a rebuilt Jerusalem? But I told you the immensity and the size of the New Jerusalem. By the way, someone did the math of this, because it's 1,500 miles wide, 1,500 miles high, 1,500 miles long. It could contain 40 billion people with a fairly good sized, large ranch. That's how big. Remember, it's a cube. So people there, 1,500 miles up. But that will only be a launching pad for our discovery of the entire vast universe that God has created. You know, God's always been. He's been creating forever past, and will be creating forever future. We're not going to run out of things to do, folks. You're not going to get bored there. It's going to be quite the place. Okay, here's a question. Who will take part in the millennial reign of Christ? Who's going to be there? Well, the Bible tells us. Now, this is a familiar passage in Matthew chapter 25. here someplace. Let's find it. Oh, here we are. Matthew chapter 25. Beginning with verse 34. Let me back up a little bit. It says, "And when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. And all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left hand." You don't want to be on the left hand. "Then the king will say to those on his right hand, 'Come you, blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. And I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me.' Then the righteous will answer him, saying, 'Lord, when did we do all these things for you?' And I'll skip down to the last verse. And the king will answer and say to them, 'Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me.'" You've read this passage many times. What does it mean? This judgment takes place at the end of the 7-year tribulation period, and all those who trust Christ during the tribulation and escape death, because remember the Antichrist is reigning and you must take the mark of the beast, escape death by Antichrist. That's one group that will go into the kingdom, as it just mentioned here. The second group that will go into the kingdom in their physical bodies, just like we have today, is the martyrs who were killed during the tribulation, who refused to take the mark of the beast. That's in Revelation 7, 9 through 14. And by the way, it says in Revelation 7, there were too many to count. These two groups will enter the kingdom age in their natural bodies, a massive number in addition to the above. People will be born and die during the millennial. Isaiah 65:20. Let me read this. This is interesting. It says this about the millennial period. 65:20. "No more shall an infant from there live but a few days." We're talking about the 1,000-year reign of Christ. "Nor shall an old man who has not fulfilled his days. For the child who dies 100 years old," in other words, at 100 years old, you're still going to be a child. That's how long you're going to live. It gets better here. "But the sinner being 100 years old shall be accursed." There's still going to be sin in the millennial kingdom, but it will be put down quickly because he's going to rule with a rod of iron, and we're going to be his agents that will help him. "They will build houses, inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For as the days of a tree, so shall the days of my people be." You know how old trees get? Thousands of years old.
So Satan will still be active during that time if there's sin?
No.
Well, where does the sin come from?
The sin comes from the human heart. That's a good question. Because Satan is bound during this
That's what
time.
I thought.
Yes, you're right. The sin comes from the human heart. It goes to show us that when Satan is loosed at the end of the 1,000-year reign and goes out to deceive the whole world are like the dust that you can't even count, will rise up an army to defeat Christ. The sin is in the human heart. "And my elect," that's us, "shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain, nor bring forth children for trouble, but they shall be the descendants of the blessed of the Lord, and their offspring with them." You go all the way back to the book of Genesis in the beginning, before the flood, and people lived to be 1,000 years old. Not 969, that was the oldest, but almost 1,000 years. So there will be a population explosion like you've never heard during this time, because 1,000 years with people living that long and having children. By the way, there's a book by Don Richardson called Heaven Wins. And he makes the case in that book, even though Jesus said, broad is the way of destruction and narrow is the way to heaven. So everybody thinks it's going to be kind of lonely in heaven. There's not going to be a lot of people there. No way. He makes the case there's going to be way more people in heaven than there's going to be in hell. And he groups it into several groups. One is what I talk about. During the tribulation period, during the millennial kingdom, there's going to be more people saved than any other time period in history. Number two, he puts all the aborted babies. How many is that? He puts them into the group. There's going to be more people in heaven than there is in hell. God's going to win. Heaven's going to win. Okay. Check my time here. I'm almost done. What role will you play, the church, in the kingdom age? Revelation 26 says they shall be priests of God and of Christ. Revelation 5:10 says, and have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth. The earth, that word is used. You may say, I don't understand that. I'd like a job description. Well, I can't give you one. You're going to be kings and priests, and you're going to be servants of the Most High God during this particular time. We will rule and reign with Christ in our glorious, immortal bodies. We're going to be ruling over people in their natural bodies, billions of people. Judgment will be quick. Isaiah 65:24 says, before they call, I will answer. And while they are yet speaking, I will hear. And I believe that we're going to have powers way beyond what we have today. I've said it before, I can't prove it. Tony told me not to say it, but I believe that we will be able to read people's thoughts in our glorious bodies, which are going to be quite different than anyone else. So we can put down revolts before they happen. There'll be no more of this penny for your thoughts. You're going to know what they are. Okay. Think of this like this, and I am ready to close. Dr. J. Dwight Pentecost said this: there is more in the Bible written about the millennial age, the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, than almost any other subject. Yet you seldom hear much about it, do we? Everybody's scared of it. You'll spend 70, 80, 90, maybe some 100 years on this earth as a test on how and where you're going to spend eternity. That's what this earth is all about. And you will spend 1,000 years here on this earth managing the affairs of our King and God. There's not even anything close in the comparison when you view it like that. Okay, we're going to close with the Lord's Prayer. And we're going to do it in the King James Version so we don't get all mixed up. It's right here in case you don't know the King James. Everybody knows the Lord's Prayer. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. And next time you pray that prayer, remember that you're praying for His kingdom to come. God bless you all. Sorry I went a little bit over.